Well, I have a bit of a cough right now, so I'll mute myself if anything happens during this lecture. But this is gender classifiers and things that go with nouns, but really what I mean there is just systems that might look like classifiers but are actually gender. So, gender and classifiers are kind of on a bit of a spectrum. It's not so much like a 0 to 100, it's more like there's clear divisions about where they can be. But we'll talk about gender and we'll talk about classifiers with this. This is just a little bit of like a summary slide. So, gender and grammar, when we talk about it, we have to be a little bit careful about how we think about gender because the meaning of gender now is more that it's a social construct. But historically, like before the 2000s, that definition was not there. Biological sex and gender were synonymous. So when we think about all of the writings that have been done on gender in the past, we have to keep in mind that this is the perspective that they were coming from. So gender's been around since like 20 or 1225 in earlier language related discussions. And I mean, it's been continuing since then. So figure out 750 years of gender being used in a specific way to talk about language. And the meaning at the time in society was more that it's biological sex than a social construct that it is now. So in reality, when we talk about gender, what we're really talking about are noun classes. So, gender and noun class are used synonymously in terms of the linguistic theory, but different languages will use different words. So, some languages might use gender because masculine and feminine and neutral line up nicely with the nouns, with semantics, but other languages will use noun class when it's a little bit less obvious, and the writings will use both. So, some people like the term gender, some people like the term noun class. So languages like French are really nice, masculine, feminine, and it corresponds with biological gender or biological sex, however we want to view it. Um, some languages are not like that. They care more about the morphology or the phonology. And in some languages, gender is more than just masculine, feminine. It also corresponds to other semantic criteria, like maybe large animals versus small animals being in different gender classes. So we still use the term gender when we talk about noun classes in linguistics, but we just have to remember that the term gender in linguistics is a little bit different than the term gender that we use like socially. So, what is a gender system or a noun class system? It doesn't necessarily have to do with masculine, feminine meanings, but rather agreement. So, a gender system comes from an agreement system. Now, what this means is that the noun has control over some other word in the sentence, and it's fixed. It's like if we have this noun, we're going to need this gender marker on some other word that is not the noun. So in English, we have this like the king loves himself versus the king loves herself. When we say the king loves herself, the majority of speakers are like, hold on a second, that doesn't make any sense because king is inherently masculine, so we should be using a masculine pronoun himself. So the fact that king is controlling another word for the form and it only accepts a very limited amount of forms with that. We call this agreement. So in other words, king, some gender feature has to agree with the gender feature of another word. Now, because of this definition, we're not limiting ourselves to the amount of genders that we can have or noun classes. I'll probably use the term gender because that's what linguists use. But this means that we can have as many genders as we want, theoretically. And there are some languages that have like 17, 20 genders. So gender comes from agreement classes. And don't think of agreement classes and gender necessarily being the same thing here. A gender system comes from it. Agreement classes are more about nouns. So let's say we have like three nouns, noun one, noun two, noun three. Maybe noun one and noun two behave a certain way together when controlling other words, and then noun three is different. So maybe there's two agreement classes. But here's the general requirements for agreement classes. Two nouns will share the same morphosyntactic markers. This means that we would take a look at, say, singular and plural and see how they interact and behave with each other. They occur in the same agreement domain. So what this means is that if we have something like this, the noun was verbing, and let's say there's a marker that is affected at some point in the verb, then if two nouns are in the same agreement class, they should be occurring in the same position. And finally, the nouns should be targeting the same item. So if two nouns are in the same agreement class, they're basically in the same place. They can do the same things as other nouns in that agreement class, and they're going to target the same word. That's all an agreement class is about nouns, and gender comes from this. So yeah, if we could take a look at, say, French, for example, we have 4 sentences, and I'm just going to circle or box the nouns in. And in each of these, what we see is that gender is going to be baked into these words. So garçon is masculine, and femme is going to be feminine in this case. I think I wrote boy here. This should be girl. So what's happening in French is that the form of the noun, the markers inside the noun, are affecting how the determiner and the adjective appear in the sentence. So garçon is mask, so when we look at the adjective grand, we expect it to be masculine. Well, if we take the feminine form, we put another marker, a feminine marker, on the adjective. And it's going to be the same with the form of the determiner. Versus I mean, in pronunciation, they're going to be pretty similar, but they are marked. So these nouns, we have 2 essentially agreement classes here. So we have one agreement class that is masculine and one agreement class that is feminine. And those appear in the same position, as we can see in every single sentence, and they target the same words. So this is an agreement class based on the definition. Now, if we take a look at Romanian, we're going to find more agreement classes, and this is a good exercise in just looking at singular and plural together, because the forms of the nouns are important. So, for example, in 7, we have barbat. And how we should be thinking about this is a word that takes nothing in the singular, and it's a word that takes E in the plural for the sound. So that's at 7a and 7b. I'm just looking at the nouns here, so maybe I'll underline all of these. In the case of 8, we have scone, and for simplification purposes, we're going to say that this takes nothing in the singular. It's actually a little bit more complicated, but the data has been reduced to remove all these phonological changes and things, and it takes a sound in the plural. Finally, with the bottom one, but it takes a in the singular, and it takes a in the plural. So when we take a look at these 3 nouns, we see 3 different things here. We see a nothing E pair, we see a nothing A pair, and we see an A pair. So these are behaving differently just in terms of the markers that they take. So we don't want to say that they have the same morphosyntactic markers for each of these together, because they don't. They might look the same in the singular, or they might look the same in the plural, but when we take a look at the whole paradigm of all the numbers that the noun can take, that's not what we see. We see that they're different. So this is just one example from each different agreement class, but there are 3 different agreement classes in Romanian. And we can see when we take a look at the rest of the sentence that we do have essentially a gender system here, because the form of the noun is going to affect the suffixes on the adjective, and then we have some plural agreement there with the verb as well. So you might be thinking, hold on a second, we were just talking about gender, but now we're talking about singulars and plurals. Well, again, the definition is just any agreement system is considered a gender or noun class system. So singular and plural might also fit that definition, and you might be thinking, hold on, that's a number system, that's not a gender system or noun class system. But by definition, it does include it. So we do have a gender system here. We have 3 different agreement classes. So we're just based off that loosely, we're expecting 3 different genders. Okay, some languages have what's called inchoate gender, and these are when you have a small set of exceptional words that don't follow the typical pattern. So here we're looking at a chart of Durop gender. Durop is another language, and we see 21 different genders. And out of those, 11 those are quoret. That means that they follow typical patterns, and we can see their frequencies here. So if we circle it, this is from a database of many, many words. And their agreement pairings. Don't worry too much about the agreement pairings in the third column right now. And then we see, hold on a second, circle that one too. Then we see a bunch of inquoret ones that only have like 1 or 2 cases. So in terms of the meaning of each of these genders, if we think about like traditional French, for example, I mean, the semantics are like masculine things, feminine things, and then there's what's called residue or others that just kind of get put into that like table flower. These don't inherently have that biological meaning, but the prototypes map very nicely. But in Durop, it's not quite that simple. So, for example, non-human animate objects are going to appear in not only 2 genders, but 4 different genders in terms of semantic meaning. So it's not just going to be the semantics alone that determine what gender you're looking at. It's going to give you a hint at what gender you're looking at for the sake of speaking and making sure that agreement is working in the language. But semantics aren't going to be the best way. In fact, one of the best ways to look at things is like, what is the agreement doing? What are the different forms it can take? So here's an example. I'm going to take a look at 4 different genders. And if we take a look at the agreement pairing, well, let's not look at that first. Let's take a look at the words. So in sentence A for gender 1, we see this thing called a-boat, and then we see a relative. You can think of this pattern as just the A's, the letters expressing some sort of gender. That's probably the best way to look at it right now. So we see that when we have a boat, we get this form of K, W, and then a vowel. We take a look at boat using a different form. So this would be plural in this case. We get F's here, and then we get an N with a vowel. So if we take a look at the word boat, remember, we're basing this off of agreement classes. The word boat itself has basically 2 options, one for singular, one for plural. One is a KW vowel as a relative, and one is an N vowel as a relative. So if we take a look at our agreement pairing, this is what we find. Gender 1 takes either KW vowel or N vowel when it's forcing agreement of, say, some grammatical term like a relativizer, or in some cases, if we take a look at the next slide, even demonstratives. So in the second gender, we see something very similar. We're looking at person. You can either take an A form or a G form, depending on whether it's singular or plural. And what we see is we see a KW vowel, and then we see a B vowel. And if we take a look at the agreement pairing, this is what we get. So person would belong to gender 2. And we can continue with this through all the different genders, and we can find these patterns. So for example, with gender 5, we see a C vowel and a B vowel when we take a look at the word goat in its different forms, singular and plural, and that's exactly what we find for gender 5. So you can think of this agreement pairing as like what's going to happen in the singular, what's going to happen in the plural. With gender 20, it's a single class here. We just see MUN, so we're being a little bit more loose with this, but we can see an M form and an M form for these 2 words. And water and wine just take whatever the H is, which I believe it's forced to be singular for class 20. Okay, but that's looking at a gender system in action. So with these 20 genders, we're not really even looking at the semantics of these things. These are things that speakers will hear, and based on the agreement, they'll be sorting into different genders. So some nouns are what we call hybrid nouns. These nouns don't fit nicely into one gender because these are nouns that can take multiple different genders. They're going to target things for agreement. So if we look at 10A and 10B from Russian, we have the word doctor in each of these cases. And what it's going to do is it's going to target an adjective here. But we can see with the adjective agreement that it can either take masculine or a feminine marker. And the meaning will still be the same. So we can still say the new female doctor in each of these. We can use masculine or feminine. So there's still some control there, but it's hybrid. It doesn't fit into one gender nicely. It can behave basically in multiple ways. And with this particular pattern, if we're trying to say the new doctor and hint that it's female implied, then 10a is going to appear more often. So with the masculine marker. But if we take a look at the same thing in terms of the predicate, the female doctor, this translation is not right. The female doctor worked would be how it should be for each of these with implied feminine. We can see that on the verb, it can either take the masculine form or it can take a feminine marker. And if we're talking about the predicate, doctor chooses the feminine marker a little bit more often than the masculine marker. So there's a set of different preferences too. If it's, how do we say this? If it's adn, what it basically wants most of the time is masculine. If it's going to be noun verb, then what it wants most of the time is feminine, but either is okay. So these are an example of hybrid nouns, and we can find them in any gender system. Now, classifiers are a little bit different than gender because it's not about agreement and control, because we're not forcing a particular gender on the thing that we're introducing or the thing that targets, the thing that needs to appear. So classifiers typically appear with nouns and numerals, and they give a little bit more information about the meaning of the noun. So they might modify the meaning. It's usually based on semantic properties, but they don't have to be. So for example, in Burmese, if we look at 12a, b, and c, we see the word river a few times. In fact, we see one river. Now, what we can do with this phrase is we can essentially change its meaning. We can modify its meaning using different classifiers. So for example, if we use river 1 and then we use the word section, we get a fishing area as a meaning. If we say river 1 in place, we get a picnic destination. If we say river 1 and then we use the classifier for lines, then we get river on a map. So the important thing here is that there's choice and it's going to affect the meaning. And these classifiers can appear for many different nouns. It's not just like we use the one for river and the meaning has to make sense. So it's going to be a little bit odd, like with the typical example, you use the term like dog and then you use the classifier for line. Maybe there's some meaning there that the language has, but you know, classifiers don't have to work with every noun if the meaning doesn't make sense, and the nouns aren't picking specific meanings that have to be there. So with agreement and gender, the noun says, I want this particular gender, it has to appear. While with classifiers, they're saying, if I want to refine the meaning, I'm going to need this classifier, but there's no specific classifier that I must include on the word river, which is the noun. So here's some examples of fruits and plants in this language. So there's many different types of classifiers that we can have. So we don't need to take a look at all of this, but we should take a look at the word fruit. So this is banana versus banana tree. These are the two meanings we're getting at. Now the base is going to be the same for both of these, but they're going to take different classifiers. So if we have the at the end of the word for banana, we get fruit. If we have peen at the end of the word banana, we get banana tree. So there's options depending on what you want to express. The noun, that is basically the word banana, is not forcing a particular type of classifier to appear. We can do the same with flower and plant below. So the first one was fruit and plant. This is now flower and plant. But if we take a look at jasmine and jasmine tree, we see the same thing. It has the same base form, and then the classifier is going to hone in on that meaning and change it. So a typical example for any sort of classifier is going to be like different shapes, different forms. So here's an example where we have stone in each case. Yeah. And depending on how we use classifiers to modify that noun, we're going to get different meaning. So when stone comes together, it's gravel. When stone is flat, it's a digging stick. When stone is round, it's going to just be a stone. So once again, these classifiers are not being forced by the noun to appear in a specific way to agree with it. It's just giving more information. So we have a language here that has 15 genders. You might think 15 genders. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the genders include things like animacy and inanimacy, masculine, feminine, other things like that. So one example we have is in 14, we have an animate marker on each of these words. So the animacy on the noun, again, with gender, we're talking about things that nouns control. So the noun, White Rock Wallaby, is going to force the adjective tame to have the same marker, which in this case is animacy. So that's why we have gender here. We're forcing something similarity. We're not changing the meaning of White Rock Wallaby to be something like White Rock Wallaby and then a classifier with, I don't know, like round to mean like a chubby one. Like that's not what we're doing here. The animacy marker is appearing on both because White Rock Wallaby is animate, therefore the adjective must also change to be animate. One important thing to mention here is that this too is going to appear on a noun. So usually with agreement, we're changing, sorry, not on a noun. This is an adjective. Is appearing on the adjective. Well, if we take a look at classifiers, these are usually their standalone words. Okay, so 14 has gender, but 15 is interesting because we have strike, which is optional, cylindrical fighting stick, strike, which is optional, and then the word new. And then the translation we get is a new cylindrical fighting stick. Now, I should say both of these have to either appear or not appear. It can't just be one. That's what I've been told. So is this word for strike a classifier or a gender marker? And here's the thing. If this just had one bit here, we just had strike at the beginning, then what we would have is a classifier because we would have cylindrical fighting stick. Strike is giving it that meaning to hone in on cylindrical fighting stick. Then we have the word new. And this strike meaning would not appear anywhere else. Well, it can't appear on the noun, but it's not like forcing the adjective to change. But as soon as we introduce two of these, now we have agreement. Because in order to have one strike, you have to have the other strike. So if we want to say the second strike, then the first strike is required. Therefore, the first strike, which is with the noun, is forcing agreement later in the sentence to include another word. So what we want to say in this case is that it's actually a gender marker and not a classifier because if we're making this simple, it has to appear twice. So one is probably modifying the noun and the other is probably modifying the adjective. They just have like very clear word forms. So now that we know a little bit more about gender, we need to think about how speakers think about gender in their minds and how they're assigning gender to words, like new words. So, I mean, this really isn't a cognitive discussion. This is more like the different types of systems and how speakers in different languages reconcile with figuring gender out. So there's a couple ways. One is just a semantic system. So this is meaning. They use meaning to determine gender. And another way to do it is more formal. So this is using like linguistic properties of words, like the morphemes that come up, or maybe the phonology. Now, all systems have semantics to some degree. So there's no system out there that doesn't use semantics at all. It's just how much semantics can you use. And gender systems where you can't use many of the semantic information, I mean, those are the ones that are more likely to be called noun classes. So there's 4 different ways we can assign systems and nouns and gender. So each language will have a gender system that falls into one of these 4 categories. Either semantic assignment, predominantly semantic assignment, so that's mostly semantics with some interesting ones, languages that do it through morphology, and ones that do it through phonology. So the speakers will determine how they do this based on the information that they're given. So with semantic assignment, there's basically no ambiguity. Biological gender, syntactic gender, they line up very nicely. So usually these are systems with masculine, feminine, and neutral. There's going to be no ambiguity here. Speakers will be able to do this with a very, very high degree of success. So in Go to Berry, here's an example. Father is masculine, mother is feminine, and then animals and non-humans without gender and all other inanimate objects are going to be neutral. So, or we call it neuter gender, but usually it's just abbreviated to NEUT. So that's a nice semantic assignment system. We're not going to talk too much about it because they're a little boring. Predominantly semantic assignment. Here's a very interesting gender system from Archie. So it has 4 genders, and 2 of them are pretty straightforward. Gender 1 we call masculine, gender 2 we call feminine. We could call these noun class 1, noun class 2, doesn't really matter. Now gender 3 and gender 4 seem to have a pretty decent contrast. So gender 3 would be domestic animals and birds, while gender 4 would be wild ones and young ones. Gender 3 has larger wild animals and birds, while gender 4 has small animals and birds. Gender 3 includes insects, which I guess are not small animals. They're insects, mythical beings as well, and then musical instruments, among other things. At gender 4, we see cutting instruments, tools, clothing, metals, liquids, and so on. So that's great, except for the fact that we have many, many exceptions. So, for example, the word for mouse is in gender 3, but it's a small animal, so it should be gender 4 semantically, which means that semantics can't be the only thing here. We also have some interesting synonyms. So town and village, these are basically synonymous in terms of their function. It's just a size difference. Town is gender 3, but village is gender 4. So there's nothing about the size of a location in the system that determines the gender. It's just the size of animals and birds. So this is interesting. And then we take a look at like the noun verb distinction, but we're talking about the word scoop as in a scoop of something versus spoon. So these are pretty similar semantically. A spoon would give you a scoop of something, but scoop is gender 3 and spoon is gender 4. So, I mean, it's a tool in a way, right? But a scoop doesn't really fit into any of the nice semantic descriptions of gender 3. So this is an example of a predominantly semantic assignment where we get a lot of nice categories, but then we get these nouns, like a lot of nouns that just don't really fit that quite right. The second to last one is morphological assignment. So this is where, we can still use semantics for a lot of different nouns, but the morphology is really what's determining it for the vast majority of them. So for example, in Russian, we have masculine, feminine gender. Those are going to be 2. And then we have a third gender with others. But the thing is, gender 1 and gender 2 also include a lot of other things. So if we take a look at masculine, we have like house, car, nerve, flag. With feminine, we have newspaper, night, ankle, openness. And with neutral, we have words like letter, taxi, ear, and banner. Now, the interesting thing is the first 3 in each row, magazine, newspaper, and letter. These are all pretty similar semantically, but they're in 3 different gender categories. And there's nothing inherently masculine or feminine when we think about like biological sex or even modern standards of gender or uses of gender. They don't really fit nicely. So instead, what's happening is that we're getting a morphology system. So when you have a noun, it can be used in different ways, so different declensions based on the position of what they're doing or the meaning. So like, is it a subject? Is it nominative? Is it an object, accusative? Is it possession, genitive? Is it in transfer to something, a dative? Is it being used as an object? Is it instrumental? Are we talking about the location of it? Is it a locative? So each of these words and each of these case paradigms, 1, 2, 3, and 4, have different systems, different conjugations. So a, u, and a for 1, if we're looking at just the singular. But then in 2, we have a, u, e, oi, and e. So they're going to change. Now, anything belonging to case paradigm 1 is going to be masculine. If they belong to 2 and 3, they're feminine. If they belong to 4, they're neutral. So when Russians hear new words and they're trying to determine the gender, they'll just listen to a couple words and then they'll make a decision based off that, based on how it's being changed. So the base form is going to help a lot with that, but hearing other people use it and hearing the agreement forms, that will help too. The last one is phonological criteria. So kafar is interesting because they have masculine and feminine gender, and that's how it's written about in the literature. But if you actually take a look at feminine and masculine, there's not a huge semantic requirement there. They might have some nice prototypes, but even the prototypes don't necessarily fit the system. Um, so it's more like semantics comes first, and then when semantics doesn't work for the majority of nouns, then it's based on phonology. So gender one is feminine if a word ends in an accented vowel, like V with some sort of accent on it, some sort of tone or pitch, then okay, we have feminine. If it ends in a consonant or if it ends in an unaccented vowel, then it's masculine. So this is how gender systems are determined in kufar, except in the case when we have a conflict between the phonology and the semantics. So an example they give is the word abba. So this is father, but it ends in an accented vowel. So it's semantically masculine, but phonologically it's feminine. In this case, what happens is the semantics will win the discussion and it will take the masculine form. So even though we have phonological assignment for a system for speakers to use, semantics will still prevail. So one last interesting thing about gender before we wrap this up is mixed semantic and syntactic gender resolution. So what happens when we take a phrase with two nouns in it conjoined, like I don't know, like Jeff and John versus Jeff and Mary versus Sue and Mary, some very typical linguistic example names. When the genders are aligned, usually agreement forces that particular gender on the last, or whatever it's agreeing with, on the target word. So in Latin, for example, with masculine, feminine, and neutral, if we had a masculine noun and another masculine noun, then we would expect whatever's being targeted to also show masculine. If it were fem and femme, we would expect feminine on the thing that's targeting. Now, different languages will have different systems, but how Latin works is if we have two different genders, then what we do, so in this case, masculine and feminine, we're going to use the masculine. If these are human, and this is mother and father, so it's human, so masculine shows up. But if we had two different genders like masculine and feminine, or masculine and neutral, or feminine and neutral, and they're non-humans, then what we'd see is we'd see neutral on the target. So different languages will use different systems for doing this gender resolution, but we just need to be aware that there's no nice simple pattern for when we do conjunctions and then the genders are different of the nouns we're talking about. It's going to vary from language to language. So that's it for this Tuesday. I know the video is super short compared to what we'd be doing in class because I'm not really stopping or slowing down. It's a video, so hopefully you can pause and then continue when you need to. But if you have any questions, I'll still hold office hours on Tuesday. I'll just be muting myself. Hopefully when you see this, I will have all the coughs edited out and you'll just be left with a little bit of a raspy voice. But yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to email me as usual.